Deepfakes, cheap fakes, a new era of disinformation. Thanks to the artificial intelligence revolution, we're seeing a permutation in all sorts of propaganda, disinformation, and not to mention direct threats to democracy and national security. But artificial intelligence could also be seen through a more benign lens. ChatGPT, AI assistant surveillance systems that could help with finding criminal groups. Not to mention how artificial intelligence is helping with medical research and all sorts of different advancements in science and technology that could help improve human lives. So, what is the real score here? Can artificial intelligence actually be employed for advancing rational, factual, and democratic discourse? And how to better fight against disinformation in the age of artificial intelligence? In order to understand these issues and dilemmas faced by democracy and not to mention journalism and academics and researchers nowadays, we have a special guest. Thank you, Jaemark, for joining
Thanks,
us.
Prof.
A lot to discuss. Obviously, artificial intelligence is the big new thing, or maybe not so new anymore, but still very big, right? We saw in the stock markets the other month that there was some sort of correction. Perhaps there was some sort of hype with the AI-related stocks, chips-related stocks. But nevertheless, I think this will still be the defining technology of the foreseeable future. From your perspective, someone who has a computer science background, someone who just did his fellowship in Harvard, focusing on the interrelationship between journalism and AI, and as someone who's been in this business for so long, including being my former boss, what is your read of the big landscape, the AI landscape, before we go to the journalism and disinformation landscape?
I think for the Philippines, we're trailing behind our audience in terms of AI. So the Philippines is one of the biggest users of AI tools, including ChatGPT. We're constantly, last year in the top 5, now we're in the top 10, while newsrooms haven't caught up to that. So for all the hype, we haven't seen newsrooms adapt to how we could use it. And if this is a technology that will change the world as the hype would have us believe, then it behooves us to try to figure out how we can use it, how we will cover it, what are the new things that we have to cover, what we have to know, because our audiences are already using these technologies.
So we were top 5, now we're top 10. What does it mean? Less people are cheating with their examinations?
I suspect it's more other countries stepping up their use.
Right.
So we were early adopters.
Adopters, yeah.
Yeah. Oo. It's funny, when I usually do workshops for journalists, sometimes journalism faculties. I would ask them, how many of you use ChatGPT? And none of them would raise their hands. I would be like, oh, don't worry, your students are already using ChatGPT before you do. So there are many issues that we could go into when it comes to that use and why we need to catch up.
But Jim, I mean, given your computer science background, obviously you're not a practicing computer scientist, but you have enough sufficient background to perhaps understand some of the technical aspects of this. What are we really talking about here? Because you have folks like Mustafa Suleyman, who actually doesn't have a background in computer science, but he's very much at the forefront of the artificial intelligence, arguing that we're looking at exponential increase in the capacity. And personally, I've tried to compare the earlier generation of ChatGPT with the older generation, in a sense, like right as Richard Heydarian about democracy and all. And I've seen some significant improvement, whereby it's almost capturing the cadence of my writing, not 80%, not 70%, but it's moving forward. What is your read of the trajectory of the precision, the accuracy, and the efficiency of the artificial intelligence technology?
So I think the technologies are brilliant in themselves, but I try not to subscribe too much to the hype. A lot of the hype, even the doomsday prognostication,
yeah.
It's part of the hype.
Exactly.
This is so good that one day it will rise up and kill us. I don't think we're there yet. It's funny because the more you use some of these tools, the more you realize how stupid they are.
Yeah.
Off the shelf, it's hard to use for journalism, because for journalism you need accuracy, you need to get your facts right, diba? All of it, you need 99%, you need 95%, all of it dapat tama. And so the hallucinations are a big problem when you use it as a as a source of
Hallucination
information.
refers is a technical term
Yes,
where they invent stuff on their own, right?
basically yes.
They bloviate, yeah.
And so, for journalism purposes, I usually tell my workshops, don't use it as a source. It's not a source of information. It's a tool for processing information, but not a source of information. It's great for asking questions where there are no right answers, no right and wrong answers. Like,
Can you give an example? Yeah.
write a speech for me for my wife's birthday, diba?
Ah, right.
Telling her how much I love her. You can choose not to use it. You can choose to use it, diba? And at the end of the day, it's up to you whether you read that speech. So no right and wrong. It just randomly comes up with flowery words for you. But if I ask it to tell me about Richard Heydarian and his background, I shouldn't expect it to give me accurate information.
Yeah.
So for media organizations, I think my work has been making them understand that. And so does that mean wala siyang use for media organizations? Actually, no. There are a lot of great uses for it as a tool, as a language
tool,
model. And so the way we look at it is not, this is some great technology that will transform everything and we won't have to do any of the work, but it's a tool to be able to make some of the things that we do in everyday life easier.
Can you tell me a little bit about how did this become so central to your advocacy, not only in terms of your career? I mean, you developed even an app for this, right? I mean, what was driving you behind this? You felt there's a lack of AI literacy. You thought there's too much hype. You thought someone is not, someone has to do this job. I mean, what is your driving, animating force?
Well, first there was the hype. Everyone was saying it was going to change the world. So we needed people who figured out how it would change our world. And the fact is, so many people claim to be experts, but there's no one doing the work of actually figuring out what it's good for, what it's not good for, how it's going to change our workflows. And so I went into it in the mindset of a journalist and how the technology can be applied to processes inside the newsroom. So one of my first projects was I made an AI bot that would process COA reports, commission and audit reports, because that's the type of thing that's a great source for journalists. But there's so many COA reports. Every town in the Philippines, every city, every provincial government, basically imagine all the LGUs and all the national agencies. There's a COA report for that. And journalists are swimming upstream against that avalanche, diba? You write stories on those that you can process, but how about all the others that you're not able to read? And so my AI tool actually tried to do that, to summarize reports that otherwise would have gone
without hallucinating, because maybe it will turn a very corrupt warlord into a bastion of good governance.
And so that's my point. In this case scenario, diba? You bring the COA report. You vetted the COA report already. You know it came from a trusted sources. You downloaded it off the official website. And then you use AI to process it to make it simpler.
So you're saying the universe of data is already pre-vetted.
Yeah.
So the guy does know, I mean, AI is not going to mess around too much.
Yeah. And so all it does is summarize it for you. Sometimes it's not even smart enough to get all of it. But the idea is that with your journalistic instinct and his power to crunch the amount of information into bite-sized pieces, you're able to make your work easier for you and to get through things faster.
This large language model, LLM and all, what are we learning so far? Because the initial idea was, as there's a learning curve, right? There's a machine learning, right? As more data comes in, it self-corrects. It's kind of a parallel to economics, this idea of self-correcting markets, right? And I felt they have similar also blind spots in that sense. There's also the other side, which says, well, essentially the AI will reflect human craziness, all the complexities, everything that we reflect on internet, including disinformation, misinformation, hallucination, everything that we're doing. What is your understanding so far? Because on one hand, the proponents are saying, give it more time, it's going to self-correct, kind of like markets, how economies explain. On the other side, people are saying, well, if it's based on a universe that is faulty to begin with because it's the reflection of the human condition, then we're never going to get to where we need to
Yeah,
be.
I think it's very important to look at it as a holistic system. Here's an example of bias in AI. When you use translate, Tagalog is a gender neutral language, right?
Siya.
Siya.
Kapatid.
Siya ay profesor.
Yeah.
If you use AI to translate that, sasabihin niya, he is a professor.
Right.
But then, pag sinabi mo, siya ay tagalinis, the AI would translate it, she is a cleaner. Right? So there's bias there. Right? And so you have to be aware of that if you're from my end, if you're using it as a journalist. Now, one of the big things for AI for newsrooms is being able to translate it into different languages, your reports, diba? Here on Signal, we do English and Tagalog reports. And that's twice the work that you could cut in half. But then you have to be aware of the biases of the AI systems that you use so that, for example, when it comes to language, it remains neutral because the systems ingested that bias using that
Is it like
data.
he, she, or is it like the person? Like for instance, how do you correct that?
You correct that with human oversight. So when I talk to newsrooms about it, the idea is always use it as a tool. Don't use it for the whole job. So figure out which jobs AI would work well for you, and then use the tool accordingly.
Well, I heard there are like even novelists who have AI, like assisted essentially. It's more like intelligence augmentation. It's more like IA than AI, whereby they let the AI run certain preliminary ideas and then they edit it and essentially redo the process and all in ways that reflects their style.
That's a good use for it, I think.
And then they're honest about it. They will also
as
reflect
long
that,
as they're transparent. It's also great for brainstorming.
Yes.
I know when you write essays, actually you can run it through ChatGPT and ask it, critique this essay.
Interesting.
And then it will actually give you where the strong points are, where the weak points are. It's all random.
Construction and all of that.
But basically it's even the arguments. So it's random, but it actually gives you a fresh set of eyes that is instantly there, whatever time at night you are writing, diba? And so if you know how to use a tool to be more productive, I think it's very helpful. But then you have to guard against the limitations and the biases.
And the algorithmic bias. I mean, the algorithmic bias, I think, first came to mind when then Google was developing this AI that made racist comments and all of that. And and this is like 6, 7, 8 years ago.
This was more than a decade ago.
Decade ago.
A professor of mine, si Latanya Sweeney was the first to highlight this. Actually, it was Google Ads. So when you search on Google for names, it would serve ads that are personalized to you, diba? And she found out when she was Googling her own name, it was asking in the ad whether she had been arrested. And she found out there was this algorithm that took black-sounding names, and if it was a black-sounding name, it would serve an ad asking if that person had been arrested. If it were a white-sounding name, it was more neutral. Check the background report of this person. And so they found out it was because people who were Googling black names were more likely to click asking if they'd been arrested. Now, obviously, there is damage there because if you're applying for a job, diba? And then the person didn't bother clicking on that to do a background check, you just assumed that there was a problem there. And so that was an example of an unchecked system, diba? Na hindi nakita
I mean, the other times, I think I also heard this from my African American counterparts, that even when it comes to some technologies, camera technology, we're not going to say which company, apparently they said if you're not Caucasian, it doesn't filter it properly or it doesn't bring it out.
Right.
So our joke is use, I don't know, Samsung, right? I mean, because if you have Asian, it immediately filters you properly.
Right.
And so we tried it on people who are kind of hybrid, like myself, right? And you could see like there's a big difference, right? So you can see even with cameras and filtering, there is a bias there. For racial bias in
that's
that
a
sense.
good that's a good example. And it's fairly harmless example, but
Yeah.
now how about if you implement that system for facial recognition
Oh,
and
wow.
security?
Right.
And if an AI system can't meaningfully tell the difference between two people of a certain
Race.
race.
And then you'll be tagged as a terrorist or tagged as something.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And
exactly. Yeah.
so, yeah, a lot of it is also the bias in the data that's available to these systems. A couple of years ago, when I was still, before my fellowship, I worked on this AI project with newsrooms from Paraguay and Argentina. We
Interesting.
were trying to use AI to tag our videos, and we found out that this big tech company, they had an out of the box product, and it didn't recognize the presidents of Paraguay, Argentina, or the Philippines
Huh.
because their training data is trained on American politicians.
Right.
And so that's already an example of bias. And so na-mention ko kanina, sa Pilipinas, our students are already using ChatGPT. But ChatGPT didn't read our libraries. They didn't read the books that were authored by Filipinos. And so when you ask it a question about Philippine history, it's gonna be dumber about Philippine history than
Yeah.
it is about American history. And
Right.
if you use that as a reference, then lugi agad yung Pilipino na gumagamit ng ChatGPT compared sa isang
So how do you
Amerikano.
create it? Like you give them more Filipino libraries?
Maybe
Yeah.
that's something
Mm.
the government should think about, the academe should think about, the industry should think about. How do you address that? Is it creating a new product, doing more research, uh, coming up with a Filipino LLM? I don't know. But it's a conversation that we should be having right now.
Are we moving towards, because when you talk about LLMs, the understanding this is universal, right? Are we moving towards fragmented LLMs? Like China has its own Great Wall, so probably they have their own LLM, right? Their AIs and all of that.
I would push back against the idea that it's universal right now
I mean,
because
supposedly that's
it's
the impression.
yeah,
Obviously, it's not, as we
it's
talk
not.
about the
Oo,
algorithmic bias.
oo.
Yeah.
So actually, one of the things I love about using LLMs is to process data. Uh, so you just give it a big data set. I'm working on a project right now where I'm putting the whole Philippine budget, the proposed budget
Right.
there, and you can ask it questions like how much intelligence funds are in
Interesting.
the budget, and then without having to know Excel or pivot tables
Yes.
or Python programming, it's gonna give you the answer based on the data that you gave. But it translates, for example, from English to data or Tagalog into data. But you can't use Cebuano. You can't
Right.
use if you use a regional language. You can't do that. And so those are the gaps that I'm seeing right now in my work. And I'm sure there are many gaps out there that I think policymakers for AI here in the Philippines should think about.
And regionally, right? I mean, a while ago before I talked, we're talking about initiatives, for instance, in Singapore, right? To make sure regional languages are reflected. Earlier in this show, we also had, DICT, USEC and officials telling us about, Cyber Command, for instance, an emergency response cyber command also in Singapore. What is your understanding of this regional in terms of ASEAN efforts to deal with reflection of regional as in dialects or languages at a subnational level?
Yeah, I think I can speak to the AI part. Singapore's thrust right now is
Yeah.
to develop its own LLM, uh, and at the backbone of it are regional ASEAN languages. So I know there have been contributions from Indonesia and Vietnam. We have representatives from the Philippines talking to them,
Yeah.
but we haven't started on the work yet. It's a big undertaking because where are you going to get the data? Is it from media? Is it from the academe? Is it from volunteers? And who are going to organize those volunteers? For example, for journalism, the most convenient use of AI is for transcribing interviews. After our interview today, your producers will run this to AI and they'll have a rough transcript of our conversation. But Cebuano journalists can't do that right now, diba? And so to train AI, you need people reading from transcripts in Cebuano and having the text typed out, diba? Who's gonna compile all that data? Who has all that data? So That's something we have to think about.
I want to talk a little bit about the politics and geopolitics of this, especially as elections come in. But first, I want to go to the economics part. Two dimension. One is this pressure on the business process outsourcing in the Philippines, and obviously this could be a problem also for our whole economy, given how much this has been the locomotive of growth. How serious is the AI threat to the kind of BPO industry we have? Probably our Indian counterparts are more in the IT and all. Probably they could be more nimble. But what about us? And the reason I ask is because some are saying there's already a diversification happening at the meso macro level, in the sense that some are probably some are operating as something else, maybe white trolling. We are hearing also reports about, I think Washington Post had the report about some of the open AI, backroom, human intervention at the like sweatshop like level is being done here in the Philippines. What is your understanding the impact on that industry, which is a locomotive growth in the Philippines?
It's gonna be transformative. There are both threats and opportunities. Let's talk about opportunities first. Now, it's a premium to be able to speak English well, to write English well, right? That's been our advantage for the longest time. But with AI, that's not as big of an advantage anymore. And so the value that you bring to that process is your technical knowledge, right? Because now it doesn't have to be just support for English. It would be nice, of course, to know at the end, but imagine the opportunity for someone who's very technically knowledgeable, but who doesn't speak or write perfect English. Now he can do that job. Diba? So that's an opportunity. That's an example.
And I heard the Vietnamese are catching up very fast
from
our BPO friends.
Yeah. And so someone from another country who may not speak perfect English, may be passable but not perfect, not in the vernacular, diba? That might be helpful for them. And so in terms of threats, ganun din. If AI is good enough to chat with the customer and for the most basic questions, for the most common questions, like 80% of customers ask the same questions, diba? So for that, would AI be a better solution? Obviously, some people who work in the industry would say, no, there's no substitute for humans. But then, AI chatbots, hindi iinit yung ulo sa customer. They wouldn't mind kahit mura-murahin sila, diba?
Patience,
Exactly. And so magta-transform yung jobs. Pero
especially for airlines.
For airlines.
Lots of people
and, reservations,
exactly.
delays, exactly. So the endless patience is there. So I think the jobs will transform, but we've seen transformation before. Like 40 years ago, there's no office where there's no secretary's pool, diba? And now we all type all our memos today. We don't have to ask to ask them to take down our dictation, diba? And so it's gonna change. How? I think smart people need to figure out exactly how it's gonna change.
Interesting. The other aspect is also this emergence of a kind of a new subsector, which is people who are doing the human interventions with open AI, this kinds of system. What is your understanding of that in terms of the important role that the Philippines is playing? Maybe perhaps at the lower end of the value chain, if I can put it that way.
I think it's so data labeling is a big part of training for the
AI generated ito or hindi.
No, it's more like ito medyo past example na to. Pero for the longest time, AI couldn't describe images, right? But they've solved that problem. And how did they do it? So take that image, for example. You need a human to tell you that's a building, right? And so what you'll do is you'll take hundreds of thousands of images, load it into AI, and say, these are buildings, these are dogs, etc.
They see a pattern.
They see a pattern, and just because of that pattern, now they're able to recognize images. The original labeling for that data were done by humans. And actually, a lot of that labeling was done here in the Philippines.
Interesting.
And so I'm sure there are other data sets. I talked about voice earlier, diba? That will need to be labeled down the line. And if they need human work, there's debate right now whether you can ask AI to create synthetic data for you or to do the labeling for you. And so that's something we need to figure out too. I'm sorry I keep saying that, but there's a lot of uncertainty in the field, diba? Where do you so a big part of what I do right now for journalism, and I think experts in other fields should do, is try to figure out where AI goes and where the human goes and what value the
I
human.
appreciate what you're doing because you're not obviously joining the hype train, which now has been somehow exposed. I mean, this could be a value of tears and opportunities at the same time. So we have to kind of hold each other hands and
Yeah.
get this right. The other aspect of economics, and of course, this is very important for us or in the world of journalism and media, is the impact it has on news industry because some of the new AIs that are coming up out are very efficient in collating news from multiple sources with different ideological leanings and kind of put it into something more centrist, if I can put it that way, but with no attribution or no monetary compensation to the original sources. And some of the biggest companies like New York Times
Yeah.
have filed lawsuits against some of the big tech companies. In Australia, there was an effort to push for revenue sharing, for instance, with Meta and some of these companies. What is your understanding of that, especially from a Philippine perspective?
I think beyond AI, our relationship with tech companies is always fraught. Sometimes we play nice, but most of the time it's adversarial, diba? This
Right.
interview is gonna be published on Facebook and YouTube, but I don't know if we're getting all we are from those relationships. So we need to always look at them as a negotiation. Parang it's always dancing with the devil. Parang there's something
Yeah.
you need from them, the distribution, the resources, but also you can't trust them fully because they're not in the same business as you are.
And your
Uh,
competitors, or sometimes they could be
yeah,
predators in that
yeah,
sense, like
but
data.
then I talked about AI, and there's a lot of research going on right now where uh, AI would collapse on itself if it is fed output from AI. Like if you use AI generated output to train it, it would collapse on itself. There are a lot of scientific papers about that. So it actually needs fresh information, fresh verified information. Where are they going to get that? They're gonna need to get that from media companies.
Exactly. So, you're not gonna get rid of the fountain. The fountain will still be important. The fountain is still legit, authentic
Yeah,
journalism.
yeah.
Yeah.
But on our end, we're gonna have to figure out how to live without these media companies in terms of fostering our own communities,
Yeah.
having direct relationships with our readers, our viewers, um, and also how to negotiate with these companies what's acceptable for us, what is not. New York Times is suing, but others are doing licensing deals. So every
Right.
news organization has to figure that out.
The different
Uh,
strategy,
uh,
right? Yeah. Speaking of, I think New York Times is doing a good job in terms of creating community. They have games, they have cooking, they have all of that. So, I think the New York Times model is encouraging in the sense that it says that you can still thrive even in an era of being threatened by big tech companies and AI and all of that. Because I think one of the problems we have is there's a lot of fatalism around it or hype, and both are extreme. I think
yeah.
predispositions which are not helpful in terms of policy decisions at the level of journalism or government. Now let's go to the latter part of our conversation, which I think is very, very important. Elections are coming in the Philippines. Earlier there'll be elections in the U.S. We had already elections in France and the United Kingdom. Big, big elections here. Um, what so far is your understanding of the impact of AI? Could we see the first AI elections, for instance, in the Philippines, whereby
Ah,
a deep proliferation of AI, generated deep fakes, probably, or cheap fakes? I think, which is more likely, right?
yeah. Uh, let's start first with the idea of misinformation and disinformation and what AI has done for that. Uh, what researchers have found is that some of the concerns are overblown. Like
Mm,
nakita mo yung deep fake AI ni Trump with black voters that was generated by AI. Everyone knew it was AI. Parang it was just really to you know
it's
to
gimmicky.
it's gimmicky, and
Gimmicky,
also it was preaching to the choir. Like,
right.
everyone was in on the joke. Even researchers, for example, who've looked at the uh, Gaza conflict,
Yeah.
the Israel Hamas war, they found that most of the misinformation being spread relied on cheap fakes, which isn't the fake. What they do is they take old photographs,
For
take
another war
from
conflict,
another
yeah.
war or old video, and then they just put it, and then it goes viral, and then they have fact checkers run after it, parang try to mitigate the damage. Uh, but what's interesting is that for AI, there are countries like India who have had their first AI election.
Oh yeah, the biggest election. I'm sorry, I didn't mention India, which is the most
The
important one.
biggest,
The most
well,
important.
quote unquote, democracy in the world,
Yeah.
right? Um, so it was their first AI elections, but the problem wasn't misinformation. I talked to a journalist to cover that.
Right.
Si Nilesh Christopher, who's doing his Nieman this year at Harvard. So we had a conversation, and he has written about how there was the feared apocalypse that didn't happen. Because it turned out what happened in India, I don't know if it's gonna happen in the Philippines, is that politicians used AI for campaigning and not for misinformation. Obviously, there are cases pa rin of misinformation, but the vast majority of the use cases for AI in elections was for voice memos,
In different
in
languages,
different
vernacular,
languages,
yeah.
and also like imagine getting a Viber message with a voice memo, and hi, this is Prof. Richard Heydarian.
I need your
Talk to me.
votes for the
Yeah,
Senate.
and
I mean, that,
di
yeah.
ba yung mas scam dito sa atin?
Interesting, yeah.
Andun na yung pangalan mo. So imagine Prof.
Yeah,
Richard Heydarian
yeah.
calling you by your name, and asking you to watch his show. How compelling would that be?
Yeah.
And so that's what they found in those. Tapos meron din yung mga deepfake na TikTok videos, yung mga ganon, dancing videos. That was really just intended to garner support rather than misinform.
Right. So it turned out as far more benign and gimmicky rather than apocalyptic. Yeah.
It's gimmicky. I don't know if it's benign. Like, I don't know. Is that an acceptable use case? Like, if it's mass-produced but personalized?
Well, some would say it's retail politics on steroids,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
or with AI characteristics,
yes,
right?
yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm sure more than enough folks perhaps would know that this is not exactly a direct call, but to hear that, sometimes we human beings are interesting, right? We know that it's performative,
Yeah.
but we're still willing to accept the
Right,
effect, right?
right,
Like
yeah,
we know
yeah.
the dancing of the politicians, all of the antics and clownery that we see during elections, but
And so this is, clownery on a
yeah,
digital
well,
level.
That's
Yeah,
a better
yeah.
way, perhaps,
Yeah.
than benign clownery.
Right.
Yeah.
And so when we develop policies, we need to understand those things. Like there was a proposal before by COMELEC to ban all AI use for the elections as campaign violations.
Interesting,
Now, if you ban even the synthetic video calls or voice calls, for example, using AI, all those would be violations. And now media would have to police that when we do tallies of election violations, and campaigns would have to police that. And so there's this question: should you police all AI use or just those that are impersonating
Yeah.
and
More
about
nefarious.
exactly misinformation? And should you concentrate all your resources on that? How do you take tech companies that allow the use of their platforms to create potential misinformation? How do you take them into account?
Right. Going back to this, the Indian case is very interesting because a lot of us were very worried about what could happen in India, considering the rise of right-wing populism and all of troubling things we've seen in terms of what is left of Indian democracy, which now it is on an upswing. Going back to the Philippines, there are a couple of red flags here. I mean, unlike India, which is a giant power, more or less secure, yes, border dispute here and there, the Philippines is already at the front line of the US-China competition. We have actually our own direct disputes with China in the West Philippine Sea, which is festering by the day as we speak. We had a certain number of cases earlier this year of cheap fakes or not so cheap fakes, implying that Marcos Jr., our president, is a warmonger and kind of trying to portray China as a victim of a US-backed kind of proxy war, all of that nonsense. We also had, the whole pulveron, personal attacks on the president, this mimicking of supposed president engaging in some, misbehavior. Shouldn't that be troubling? Because unlike in India, which has its concerns with China, border dispute in the Himalayas, where I'm not going to underestimate that, the Philippines is kind of in the thick of action. And we know that there are even concerns of maybe even Russia being involved in disinformation campaigns in the Philippines. What is your understanding of that front?
I would add to that, even the U.S. is involved in misinformation
The Reuters
operations. The
report, you're talking about the
Reuters report.
vaccines, and which
Yeah.
I thought was ridiculous because
And,
trust ratings were already so low in
yeah,
Chinese
yeah,
vaccines. I mean, I felt that was one of the most self-defeating,
yeah.
nonsensical move by any major power, right?
But it also
But thank you
shows,
for pointing that
yeah,
out.
yeah. But it also shows you that
It may not
even
be that
supposed
effective.
friends,
Oh yeah,
contribute to worsening our information
they're
ecosystem.
superpowers with their own
Yeah,
interest. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. And so we are vulnerable to operations like that. Uh, Thankfully, we in the media, there are efforts to try to mitigate that. We have two different fact-checking networks that are trying to do fact-checking and also.
does fact checking work? Because some people are very skeptical. But I said it has to be done. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary,
Yeah,
right?
there are two things about that. One is fact checking, and then there are other techniques like pre-bunking and trying to educate the audience before they fake news reaches them.
Yeah.
But the
Na may
other,
paparating na fake polvoron video, mga ganyan.
uh, or
Huwag
or
kayo maniwala,
even
ganun.
or even our conversation right now about
Yeah.
AI. If the audience sees how easy it is to manipulate video and to generate AI deepfakes, then maybe they won't accept everything they read online. Maybe now there's an opportunity to tell them, go back to trusted sources, go back to sources that vetted the information before you share anything. A guy can dream, di ba? But the other side of it, I think the value of fact-checking networks and other work that journalists do, researchers do, like Jonathan Corpus Ong, he's the top
Right.
researcher in the US studying the Global South, is quantifying the type of disinformation, classifying and quantifying that, and then doing research on that, and trying to figure out effective strategies to combat it. And so there's one thing, yung fact checking na in the moment you try
Yeah.
to mitigate the spread of false information, but then also the body of work, the body of knowledge that needs to be built up so that we're able to one day perhaps be more effective in trying to reach audiences and making them immunized from misinformation.
I want to go back to this again to use the economics framework. A lot of our discussion is supply side, right? What do companies do? What we journalists do? We don't talk about the demand side, like what is the reception part of this equation. Um, from some of the studies I've seen, because I had to write about populism and research on that, is there's a demographic differential, right? Like Gen Zs very differently process information than older generation. In 2016 and a little bit afterwards, we saw that actually the receptiveness to this information was more prevalent at the upper end of the demographics rather than lower end. Some of the recent studies, for instance, including the Philippines, show that, for instance, with the Gen Zs, though, they are skeptical, but at the same time also they don't seem to read much more beyond the headlines of mainstream media and go to the comment section. So
Yeah.
it's a completely different consumption, information consumption culture than perhaps millennials and Gen X, right? So what about the demographic aspect of this?
Before that, no, you'd love this because at Harvard I took a class under Pipa Norris,
Right,
the
right, of
biggest
course.
expert
Yeah,
on
yeah.
democratic backsliding in the
Yes,
world.
yes, yes.
And
OGs, yeah.
it's funny because we in the media, we talk about misinformation and we think it's all our fault that we didn't put a stop into this. But actually, that class showed us na hindi lang supply side, as you mentioned,
Yes, the demand
but
side.
there's all these other factors. There's demographics, there's gender, for example. In
Absolutely.
South Korea, there's a big left-right divide among
and
men and
gender
women.
fight, yeah,
Right,
yeah, yeah.
right. And so it's a bigger question than just us and just and also the discourse about Bobo Dante doesn't put into.
I mean, that's my thing. This obsession with disinformation just denies the agency of our voters, as
Yeah,
if they're
yeah.
a bunch of like information zombies. They're not. They're
Yeah.
processing it very differently. I mean, sorry for getting a bit worked up on this because I think everyone knows the backdrop of our conversation here. Because I think whole folks have made cottage industry out of this. Disinformation explains everything nonsense, right? Just to be honest about it. Like for instance, I saw this interesting report about the Taliano gold issue, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And actually, there was a survey that I think Vox, for instance, Vox made the report on this, which is they asked people, and a lot of them said, "Of course, we know it's not true,
Yeah.
but we're so pissed off at the other side.
Right.
We're for the sake of
Yeah.
just cynicism and all, we're gonna,
Yeah.
you get what I'm saying,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
I mean, kahit hindi, basta makapang-Alaska na lang ako,
Exactly.
diba?
Pang-asar lang namin sa
Oo.
kabila, sige Talyano go.
Oo.
And this is demand-side analysis, which
Yeah.
I completely don't see in any of a
Right.
lot of our media friends'
Yeah.
analysis. Right?
Yeah, well, I don't know. We in media love to navel gaze a lot. And so, to be fair to us, I think we also reflect a lot on what we could do better.
And we should, yeah.
And we should. But I think that the what you said, the demand side, we have a lot of scholars looking into that.
Right.
I hope we are, and I think their voices need to be heard
Absolutely.
also, because it's not just media, and it's not just information. It's also demographics, as you mentioned. It's also about culture. It's also
Yeah.
about the context of history and what has happened over the last 40 years that people may be getting more cynical. We should also look at education. And so that's a good framework for looking at this
Yeah.
problem, no? Not just, one particular issue. The same way that with AI, to bring our discussion back full circle, diba? You have to look at the whole system where the biases are coming in rather than just the technology.
We're coming to the full circle. I mean, I really enjoyed this conversation. I want to ask you one more thing. North Koreans, Chinese, Iranians, Russians, they have very effective cyber force from what we understand based on at this latest development. We're saying even the most powerful countries are vulnerable to cyber forces in some of these countries. Do you think the Philippines can become a cyber power in a sense? I mean, this might sound so amateurish. I'm not a computer scientist, but I do gaming, and like I know we have very good gamers who can learn programming very fast. We heard from our DICT friends that they want to have this kind of programming education, even at the lower, at the lowest, I mean, at the earliest, educational levels, like kids pa lang, turuan mo na mag-programming. What is your understanding from that? I know you're not a gamer enthusiast per se, but what is your understanding of the lay of the land in terms of the talent and the pool and what we can put together to build our own cyber force?
There's a lot of work to be done in terms of broadening our technical capability. Even in BPOs, for example, there's a reason all the technical stuff are in other countries and the service stuff are the Philippines, because it's harder to find great talent in a small pool of programmers, for example. And so I think technical knowledge needs to be stepped up.
Is this a government, private sector collaboration? What are you looking at here?
Yeah, it is. It's also using technology to expose people to technology at an earlier age. I mean, I was lucky. I went to Philippine Science High School, and I took computer science classes from first year high school, and
Early exposure,
I knew programming from then, diba? I don't know if kids today have that. If you're not in a science high school, for example, how fast are you exposed to these things? Some of them, a lot of the people who do hacking online are exposed because they're perpetually online, and then they learn from that. And so what are the frameworks wherein we educate these kids who would be programmers, who would be hackers, who would be, our cyber force? Yeah. And so again, I go back to what's the holistic viewpoint. If you're just going to use it for, as a cyber army to attack or defend, I don't know how productive that would be in the whole context of things.
So you're looking at a bigger industry,
Yeah,
I think semiconductors, programming.
Even just, tech literacy and AI literacy, for example. So being able to understand data, for example, being able to do programming. AI is very good at being a co-pilot for building applications right now. So talk about opportunity, there may be opportunity there. But also understanding concepts. For example, we always hear about government websites being hacked, right? And a lot of it is because of poor hygiene in terms of
Digital
security,
hygiene.
digital hygiene. What are the best practices? If you're a system administrator,
Right.
how do you maintain your system to be able to patch up
It's just
vulnerabilities?
sloppiness.
Uh,
Yeah.
a lot of government agencies still use Gmail for their emails, diba? Which is a problem because anyone can just spoof your email address to something that sort of looks official at gmail.com,
Yeah, exactly.
and then you can already scam people. And so it has to be a more holistic view rather than just, they have trolls or they have hackers. Let's hire our own hackers so we can hack them back.
Well, we should be able to. We
We
have great
should,
gamers here to fight back. I mean, it's
yeah.
like, we cannot be sitting duck.
Yeah, I think the gamers are a good pool,
Yeah.
given that there's a lot of interest already in technical
Yes.
issues. You go to message boards, for example, you go to Reddit
Absolutely.
or Pinoy Programmer, you see interesting discussions. But I think we need to build a broader base.
Yeah.
Even if we say there's a lot of us, but there are 110 million of us, and how many of
Right.
those are actually into tech?
So essentially, a national AI blueprint.
Yeah, where I think there needs to be that.
Yeah.
There also needs to be a national effort to bring people more interested into
Yeah.
tech, and to upgrade their skills, no? Hindi lang yung basta marunong ako mag-computer, but the more advanced skills too.
We started on a somber note, but I think we're on the positively sober note. Thank you very much, Jaemark,
Thank
for
you,
that
Prof.
really,
Great to
really
see you again.
important and I think compelling overview of this. I think we can go 3-4 hours on this issue,
Yeah.
but thank you for squeezing that into less than an hour. Where can people? What is your app, by the way, and where can people get to know more about your great work?
Just follow me on socials. I'm always Jaemark everywhere. So just I post the links to my work there, and yeah, I'll see you there too.
Thank you very much, Jaemark. Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify, YouTube, and Google Podcast. I'm Richard Heydarian, and that was a View from Manila. We're One News, all sides, all the time.